The Anunnaki didn't die in the records. They didn't lose some final war and vanish in smoke. They didn't fade the way dynasties fade, first diminished, then forgotten. They simply stopped appearing as active authorities. And the scribes who noticed this, if they noticed it at all, kept writing anyway. Temples remained. Rituals continued. Kingship persisted. The clay kept receiving impressions. The archive kept expanding. But somewhere between the early Sumerian tablets and the later Babylonian chronicles, divine intervention became divine memory. A presence became a precedent. A voice became an echo. And no tablet ever stops to explain why. That's the unsettling thing. Not that gods appear in ancient texts, that's expected. It's almost ordinary. The unsettling thing is the way their role changes without any official announcement. The way the record shifts from documenting presence to documenting absence. The way it keeps going as if nothing happened while something fundamental has changed. So, before we begin, only briefly, take a moment to like this video and hit subscribe. Only if you're drawn to histories that don't resolve cleanly. Histories that leave the uncomfortable parts intact. Histories that ask what silence means. What it means when power withdraws without explanation. When authority steps back and never files a report. And if you're still here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Not because the comment section needs filling, but because I want to imagine this question stretching across continents and time zones, because that, in a way, is what the tablets do. They connect minds separated by distance. They connect attention separated by centuries. Tonight we're reading ancient clay, not for what it says, but for what it stops saying. We're tracing a pattern across millennia where divine names shift from legal guarantors to ritual memories, where kingship transforms from a mandate lowered from heaven to an office inherited through bloodlines, where the most meticulous record keepers in human history simply move from one era to another without recording why the nature of presence changed. And the first place to look, the first place to listen, is not myth, it's accounting. In the beginning there were names, not prayers, not cosmologies, not elaborate creation myths told for the thrill of it. Just names pressed into wet clay alongside inventories of barley and livestock. Around 3300 BC in the city of Uruk, scribes learning the world's first writing system included divine names in the earliest exercises: An, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, names that show up like headings, like categories, like entries. You have to get correct because someone is going to check your work. These aren't theological abstractions in these early contexts. They appear in offering lists, in land transfers, in temple redistribution records, documented with the same bureaucratic precision used for counting sheep. And it matters that these are the earliest texts, because the earliest surviving writing from Uruk doesn't arrive as a grand mythic statement about the universe. It arrives as administration. It arrives as logistics. It arrives as the city keeping track of itself. The tablets from Uruk's Iana precinct are small, barely larger than your palm. Pressed from river clay that still holds faintly the mineral scent of the Euphrates when humidity touches them in museum storage. Their marks are crude by later standards, wedge-shaped impressions made with cut reeds. Each character is a record of pressure, of intention, of a scribe's hand pushing symbols into soft mud before the sun could bake it permanent. And there they are, among the mundane economics of temple administration, among tallies of grain rations and beer distributions. The Anunnaki named not as distant cosmic forces, but as recipients, as owners, as authorities whose holdings require documentation. That's what makes these earliest references so compelling. There's no origin story attached, no explanation of who these beings are or why they matter to the functioning of the city's economy. They're simply embedded in the system, woven into the administrative machinery of the world's first urban centers. As if every scribe learning their profession understood something basic, that certain portions of the harvest belong to the temple, and certain portions of what the temple controls belong to beings whose names must be recorded with absolute accuracy. This isn't worship, as we usually imagine it. It's accounting that treats divine authority as a category requiring the same documentation as livestock herds and field measurements. And then a more unsettling detail, these earliest tablets show no clear progression from simple to complex divine understanding. The Anunnaki appear fully formed in the written record, with established names and roles, as if the scribes were documenting something already understood long before writing existed. As if the knowledge predated the medium. As if oral tradition carried the structure until cuneiform finally gave it permanent, verifiable form, permanent form that reads less like myth-making and more like witnessing, like institutional record-keeping, like documentation of something observed rather than imagined. And once you see that, once you let that possibility sit, you start to notice something else. The Sumerian king list tells us something profound changed. Not gradually, not through slow cultural evolution, but structurally. The cuneiform is precise about this. Kingship descended from heaven. Before that moment, according to these chronicles, there was no organized governance in the way later Mesopotamians recognized it. Then something shifted and everything transformed. And the phrase itself, kingship descended, is worth lingering on. Not founded, not established through human effort. Descended, a verb implying movement from above to below, from sky to earth, from somewhere else to here. The list that follows records kings who reigned for impossible spans. And the numbers are recorded with the same administrative tone used for everything else, as if the scribes compiling this document believed they were preserving chronology, not composing legend. Modern scholars offer various explanations, and we'll return to them. But before we try to explain, we have to sit with what the text does. It preserves a boundary. It preserves a before and an after. It preserves a memory of structural change. And that boundary matters for our larger question. Because if the records can preserve a shift in the nature of kingship, if they can preserve a line between an age of impossible reigns and an age that collapses toward ordinary time, then it's not unreasonable to ask whether the records also preserve a shift in the nature of divine presence. Not with a trumpet blast, not with an announcement, but in the way bureaucracies preserve change quietly through altered categories, through what gets written down, through what stops being written down. So we begin where the archive begins, with names in ledgers, and we follow those names forward slowly until we reach the point where they are still invoked, but no longer act. In the next part, we stay in Uruk a little longer. We keep our attention on the tablets themselves, not myths, not epics, but receipts and transfers and lists. Because if divine authority once lived inside the machinery of administration, then its withdrawal would leave fingerprints there, first faint procedural, easy to miss unless you read like a scribe reads. And we're going to read that way. If you want to understand what ended, you have to understand what existed. And the earliest tablets make one thing unmistakably clear. The Anunnaki were not treated as abstract theological concepts. They were embedded in the institutional machinery of early Sumer with an administrative specificity that myths don't require. The Iana precinct in Uruk, the temple complex dedicated to the goddess Inanna, produced thousands of tablets between 3,300 and 3000 BC. These aren't hymns. They aren't creation epics. They are economic documents, receipts for barley deliveries, ration lists for temple workers, land transfer agreements, labor assignments for canal maintenance. And throughout these mundane records, divine names appear not as invocations, not as blessings, but as accounting categories. It's a quiet kind of evidence, the kind you can almost overlook because it doesn't scream, it doesn't insist, it just repeats. A tablet records grain moving from one storehouse to another. Another records beer distributions to workers. Another records livestock assigned to shepherds. And woven into the lines, like you might note an institution, a household, a department, are divine names that function like ownership labels. A field is measured. Its irrigation access is noted. Its output is anticipated. And then the owner is specified in the same tone used for everything else. Field of Enlil, southern parcel, assigned to the temple administrator for beer production. Enlil doesn't receive metaphorical tribute here. He owns real estate measured in units managed by human personnel and accounted for in yields. The field exists in the same world as any other field. It is subject to the same bookkeeping discipline. Another tablet lists sheep distributed from temple holdings. 63 ewes property of On, 41 rams property of Enki, delivered to a shepherd for seasonal pasture. Again, not prayer language, not myth language, inventory language. The gods hold livestock portfolios. The animals bear their marks. The shepherd is responsible for increase or loss. Follow-up tablets track births and deaths. Wool production, the slow arithmetic of growth and depletion. And this is what separates these records from the mythic register. Myths exaggerate. They amplify. They transform ordinary events into cosmic drama. These tablets do the opposite. They reduce divine ownership to the language of practical management. They apply accounting standards to the holdings of beings who in other genres create the cosmic order. Why bother? Why write property of Enki on a list of sheep unless that category mattered in the administrative reality of the temple? Why keep parallel records for divine holdings unless someone somewhere treated those holdings as distinct, as governed by different expectations? The temple redistribution economy offers one answer, though it raises more questions than it resolves. Temples in early Mesopotamia functioned as primary economic institutions. They collected offerings, managed agricultural production, employed craftsmen, and redistributed goods to workers and dependents. This system required detailed record keeping, and that record keeping consistently categorized certain holdings as divine property. Fields designated as belonging to and produced grain that flowed through accounting streams distinct from fields owned by the temple institution itself or by private individuals. The distinction mattered enough that scribes maintained it with consistency. And consistency is not an aesthetic choice in administration. It's evidence of function. Temple administrators could be held accountable for mismanaging human-owned property, The tablets suggest they could also be held accountable for mismanaging divine property, tracked separately, preserved, separately documented, as if someone might audit the difference. And perhaps that's the point that lingers the longest audit, because behind every record is an assumption. Behind every tablet is an implied question. Who needs to know this? Accounting exists because someone, some authority, cares about accuracy. Someone expects the numbers to match. Someone expects categories to be respected. So, when the scribes treat divine ownership as an accounting category, they imply that divine authority is not merely ceremonial. It has operational weight. It governs how resources are allocated. It governs how responsibility is assigned. It governs how legitimacy is framed. And the tablets don't explain that. They don't pause to say, we do this because the gods demand it. They don't pause to say, we do this because it maintains order. They simply do it. They record, they repeat, they preserve the system's assumptions in clay. Which brings us back to that earlier discomfort, the lack of progression. These earliest tablets don't read like first attempts at organizing divine concepts. They read like a mature bureaucracy already familiar with divine categories. The Anunnaki appear already slotted into the administrative logic, ownership, authority, entitlement, as if the scribes were not inventing these categories but inheriting them, as if the gods were not being introduced to the record but already present in the city's structure long before the record existed. And when you accept that possibility, even tentatively, you start to see how the later silence becomes more meaningful. Because if the gods once lived inside the machinery of administration, if they were not only worshipped, but recorded as owners, as authorities, as categories, with economic consequence, then their withdrawal would not necessarily look like a dramatic theological crisis. It would look like a gradual administrative shift. It would look like categories that remain in ritual language but lose operational weight. It would look like names that remain in prologues and invocations but vanish from the mechanics. It would look like a bureaucracy that keeps going. Temples still functioning, kings still ruling, while the record quietly stops treating divine authority as active oversight. And that's why we're staying with the documents that feel least dramatic. Because the most dramatic change may not be in myths. It may be in procedures. The administrative tablets also preserve another concept that begins to bridge this gap, the me-divine decrees or authorities that can be transferred, granted, or withdrawn. Later myths describe the me as cosmic powers, the authority over warfare, the knowledge of craftsmanship, the right to judge. But in administrative contexts, the me read like transferable institutional jurisdictions. A temple receives the me of justice, meaning it gains jurisdiction over legal disputes. A city receives the me of kingship, meaning it gains political supremacy. And there are tablets that record these transfers with the tone of a jurisdictional agreement. Authority moving from one house to another, witnessed by officials, preserved because it has legal weight. And when authority can be transferred, when it is recorded as a thing that moves, then the question becomes unavoidable. What happens when authority moves away and does not return? In the next part, we step into the king list more directly. Because the king list is not simply a mythic narrative. It is a bureaucratic chronicle that claims to preserve the structure of legitimacy across time. And inside that structure is a boundary, before the flood, after the flood, so stark and carefully maintained that it begins to resemble the very pattern we're tracing with divine presence. Not a gradual fading, a line, a shift, a change preserved without explanation. The Sumerian king list doesn't read like a myth. That's part of the problem. It reads like a register, like a document a bureaucracy would produce when it needs to establish legitimate succession legal continuity and the right of one city to claim precedence over another. It names rulers, it names cities, it assigns reign lengths, it moves forward with clerical patience. And then embedded inside that administrative format, it preserves something that shouldn't fit an era measured in spans no human could witness. The list opens with a phrase repeated across surviving versions. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu, not founded, not negotiated, not achieved by conquest or assembly, descended. A verb that implies movement from above to below. A transfer from somewhere else to here. Then the list begins, naming kings of the pre-flood world rulers who governed before the great flood that Mesopotamian tradition treats as a dividing line. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shurupak, 5 cities, 8 kings, and reign lengths recorded with numerical specificity that feels almost bureaucratically indifferent to how impossible they are. Alulim ruled for 28,800 years. Alulgar reigned for 36,000. Enmenluana held kingship for 43,200. And so it continues. Now modern readers hear those numbers and immediately reach for symbolic interpretation. We do it almost reflexively because the alternative is uncomfortable. No human reigns for tens of thousands of years. So we assume the document is myth. We assume the numbers are metaphor. But the king list does not behave like a mythic text. It behaves like an administrative one. It does not signal, now we are in symbolic time. It does not shift tone. It does not offer poetry. It offers entries, names, places, numbers, succession. And then the text states simply, almost coldly, the flood swept over, and everything changes. After the flood kingship is in Kish. The first post-flood king reigns for 1,200 years. Still impossible by modern standards, but already a dramatic collapse. His successor rules for 960, then 600, then 400. Within a few generations, reign lengths compress towards spans that might fit within human memory. By the time the list reaches dynasties, we can place historically the reigns become fully conventional. 7 years, 15 years, 23. The same list, the same format, the same bureaucratic voice. So the question returns quietly, insistently. If the numbers were merely symbolic, why does the text preserve such a sharp boundary? Why not a gradual transition? Why not a slow decay from mythic spans into human ones? Instead, we get a cliff, tens of thousands, then suddenly 1,200, then quickly down toward human scale. Something fundamental changed, and the scribes remembered it precisely enough to embed the change in their official chronologies. Modern scholarship offers explanations. Perhaps the reign lengths represent dynasties rather than individuals. Perhaps the years are counted in different units. Perhaps the pre-flood section is a constructed pedigree, an ideological attempt to stretch the roots of civilization deep into a heroic past. But even if those explanations are plausible, they don't dissolve the structure of the document. They don't remove the boundary. They don't erase the feeling that the scribes are preserving a before and after. And it's not only the numbers, it's the phrase that frames them. Kingship descended from heaven. That phrase does more than legitimize rule. It describes a transfer event. It describes an arrival of authority, as if authority itself was not originally human. And once you accept that the king list preserves the memory of a transfer, you begin to wonder whether the archive preserves other transfers as well, like the transfer from divine presence to divine distance. The king list is not alone in preserving boundaries. Mesopotamian flood traditions do the same: a world before catastrophe, a world after. Legal texts show authority being granted, then administered by humans. Epic literature marks the end of hybrid figures like Gilgamesh. The pattern repeats a shift, a handover, a structural change that becomes normal without being explained. And the king list is particularly important because it is copied, it is maintained, it is preserved across cities and centuries. Scribes who lived long after the pre-flood era the text describes still reproduce the same pattern. The Weld-Blundell prism, a later and more complete copy, dates to around 1800 BC. Other fragments span different places and times, yet the structure remains, which means the boundary was not a one-time storytelling flourish. It was part of the tradition the scribes considered worth preserving. And that raises the question we keep circling. Why preserve a boundary if it never mattered? Why maintain impossible reign lengths with bureaucratic precision? Why not round them, soften them, poeticize them? Why keep the sharpness? The text offers no commentary, no footnotes, no justification. It simply records. And that is the quality we're following, because the question of the Anunnaki is not only were they believed in, of course they were. The question is, what did it mean to treat them as operational authorities? And what did it mean when that operational authority became something else? The king list suggests Mesopotamians understood time itself as divided by structural events, the descent of kingship, the flood, the compression of reign lengths. And when you place that beside the administrative tablets that treat divine names as owners and authorities, you begin to see a possible alignment, an era of direct divine presence in structures of power. A boundary event. Then a gradual move toward human-scale governance, still under divine mandate, but increasingly administered by human systems. And even as we say that, we have to say it again, because it's the kind of thought that needs repetition to become clear. Not that the gods disappeared from belief, but that they changed from participants to precedents. Not that temples closed, but that the role of divine authority within the machinery became less direct. Not that religion weakened, but that intervention became memory. In the next part, we widen the lens to the archaeological rhythm. The script itself points to the sudden acceleration of the Uruk period, the leap from villages to cities, the emergence of monumental architecture and functional writing in a narrow span. Because the king list claims kingship descended, archaeology shows a revolution in complexity. And the administrative tablets show divine names already functioning as categories within that revolution. And then later, the documents show another shift, subtle, procedural, but persistent. The gods stop acting. We're going to hold all of that together, not to force a final conclusion, but to listen for the moment when presence becomes precedent. The king list preserves a boundary. The early administrative tablets preserve a structure, and archaeology quietly, stubbornly preserves a rhythm. Around 3,500 BC, within a span of just a few centuries, southern Mesopotamia undergoes a revolution. Scattered agricultural villages give way to true cities with populations in the tens of thousands. Monumental architecture appears. Temples are built with sophisticated understanding of engineering, astronomy, and geometric proportion. Writing emerges not as a tentative set of scratches, but as a functional system capable of recording complex transactions and abstract concepts from its earliest attestations. Irrigation networks are constructed that require centralized planning, mathematical precision, and coordinated labor on a scale that feels difficult to reconcile with how recently these populations lived in village systems. And the point is not that development never happens quickly. Human beings can innovate rapidly under pressure. Systems can crystallize fast when enough people are concentrated, when enough resources are at stake, when administration becomes necessary for survival. The point is the compression. The feeling that the leap is too comprehensive to be comfortable. One moment scattered farming communities. The next an urban civilization operating at a level of complexity that would shape the ancient world for millennia. Archaeologists call this the Uruk period. And even within conventional scholarship, it is recognized as a transformation so complete that its speed remains difficult to fully explain. And in the tablets pressed during this revolutionary period, the Anunnaki are already there, already established, already functioning as institutional authorities whose presence requires no justification, no introduction, no origin story, only documentation. This is the crucial alignment the script keeps returning to. If the leap into city life is fast, and if writing appears as a mature administrative tool, and if divine names appear in the very first administrative records as operational categories, then divine authority is not something added later as a poetic layer. It is part of the machine from the beginning of literacy. And yet, here is the other pattern. The tablets also show it didn't last forever. Somewhere between the early Sumerian period and the later Babylonian era, something shifts again. Not in the existence of cities, which continue to grow. Not in the existence of temples, which remain centers of economic and ritual life. But in how divine authority is recorded. In whether divine authority appears as active presence or remembered ancestry. The change is subtle enough that you could miss it if you weren't reading carefully across centuries. But it's there, preserved in the progression of texts like sediment layer by layer, not dramatic, not announced. The Anunnaki do not disappear in cosmic battle, they do not die, they simply stop intervening in human affairs. And the record notes that absence with the same patience it once used to note their presence. That's the discomfort, because bureaucracies are not designed to preserve mysteries. They are designed to preserve continuity. They are designed to keep the machine running. So, what does it mean when the machine continues and the categories remain, but the active presence recedes? To answer that, we have to stay with the earliest evidence a little longer, not because it's exciting, but because it's foundational. Because the early administrative texts show divine authority as practical. Not only worshipped, owned, not only invoked, measured, not only feared, managed. A field near a city wall has dimensions irrigation access and ownership. Enlil's field. A list of sheep isn't blessed by Enki, it is property of Enki. The words are dry. The effect is profound, because when you treat divine power as property ownership, you treat it as operational reality. You treat it as something that can be mismanaged, something that can be transferred, something that can be documented. And that leads us back to the concept of the me, those divine decrees or authorities that can be granted, moved, and withdrawn. In later myth, The me become cosmic powers, portable truths. But in administrative language, they look like jurisdictions, like legal capacities, like governance functions that can be assigned to institutions. A temple receives the me of justice, meaning it gains jurisdiction. A city receives the me of kingship, meaning it gains supremacy. A tablet records the transfer of the me of grain storage from one divine house to another, witnessed by officials, preserved, because it changes who controls real resources. This is not simply mythic imagination. It is administration describing authority as transferable. And transferable authority implies something else. Authority can also be removed, which is where the larger question tightens. If divine authority can be transferred through bureaucratic process, what does it mean when divine authority stops being recorded as active? Is that simply a change in writing style? Is it a cultural shift in theology? Is it the natural maturation of institutions, humans taking over daily administration, while gods remain symbolic? Or is it a memory of withdrawal? Something the scribes registered, even if they couldn't explain. The script itself offers the critical observation. The scribes never explain. The archive never pauses. The tablets don't say now. The gods no longer intervene. They simply stop showing intervention. So the only way to detect change is by tracking patterns. Tracking how divine names appear in early records, owners, recipients, authorities. Tracking how later records still invoke the same names, but differently. Tracking how legal codes once framed gods as active judicial overseers, then gradually move toward gods as distant authorizers. Tracking how kingship is once framed as descending from heaven, then becomes inherited office. Tracking how the epics preserve the end of hybrid figures like Gilgamesh, and how later rulers no longer claim measurable divine fractions. Tracking how the highest god Anu remains supreme, yet rarely acts an absence that becomes a model. And tracking how later empires like the Neo-Assyrian world invoke gods constantly without expecting them to speak. It is not one shift, it is a drift, but a drift that moves in one direction from presence to distance, from intervention to structure, from active authority to authorized system. In the next part, we return to the administrative evidence one more time, but with sharper focus. Not just that divine property is recorded, but how the temple economy depends on that distinction, and how the precision of the records suggests accountability to something beyond human supervision. Because if early scribes recorded divine holdings as if someone might audit them, the disappearance of divine auditing, of divine operational presence, would be the most consequential silence of all, and yet the machine keeps running, which is precisely what makes the silence so difficult to ignore. The temptation when we see divine names on early tablets is to treat them as decorative, as theological wallpaper, as ritual language draped over ordinary economics. But the Iana Precinct tablets resist that reading not by arguing, not by persuading, but by behaving like an archive. They separate categories. They maintain parallel accounts. They keep distinctions stable. And stability is a form of evidence. If divine names were merely symbolic, the records could have invoked them loosely. They could have used them like blessings, sprinkled inconsistent rhetorical. Instead, they're used like ownership markers. Field of Enlil, property of On, rams of Enki, holdings assigned, measured, tracked. And we keep returning to the same question because it won't let go. Why bother with this level of precision if the gods are only metaphors? Why write property of Enki with the same seriousness as property of the temple administrator, unless the distinction changes responsibility in a real way? Because that's what accounting does. It assigns responsibility. It makes loss visible. It makes mismanagement legible. And the temple redistribution economy makes those stakes sharper. Temples are not small religious chapels in early Mesopotamia. They are economic institutions. They manage land. They employ workers. They redistribute rations. They store grain. They maintain herds. They coordinate labor for canal maintenance, which means the temple's records are not casual. They are survival technology. If you miscount grain rations, workers go hungry. If you mismanage herds, wool production collapses. If you fail to coordinate canal labor, irrigation fails fields, dry yields crash. So, when the temple scribes keep a separate stream for divine property, they're not doing it for poetry. They're doing it because the system treats that category as real. And the system treats it as real across thousands of tablets. It is not a one-off. It is not an anomaly. It is the texture of the archive. Now, critics might argue this simply reflects how ancient people conceptualized their world. They projected institutional structures onto their gods because they could not imagine power operating any other way. It's a reasonable argument. But the tablets complicate it, because these scribes were not incapable of distinguishing symbolic ritual from functional management. Their archives show it repeatedly. They record ceremonial offerings in one format. They record economic distributions in another. They track labor assignments with practical specificity. They separate categories that matter. So when they choose to treat divine holdings with the language of management, the choice has weight. It suggests that divine property was not merely a story. It was a category that had consequences. And consequences imply accountability. Not necessarily accountability in the sense of a god appearing to punish a scribe for errors, but accountability in the sense that the institution believed mismanagement of divine property mattered differently than mismanagement of ordinary property. And the tablets preserve that belief without explaining it. They simply act as if someone might audit. And if someone might audit, then the audit itself becomes a ghostly presence in the records, an implied authority behind the discipline. Which brings us back to the Anunnaki, not as mythic beings in stories, but as names in ledgers. Because the script's argument is not that the gods are real in the way modern people debate. The argument is that the gods were treated as operational categories. And when operational categories change, when they recede, something is happening in the machine. We see this in the way temple holdings are managed. We see it in the way the me are described. We see it in the king list's boundary. And we will see it again and again in later texts, gods invoked as sources, but absent as operators. But before we move forward, we have to sit with one more detail from the administrative world, the ME as transferable institutional authority. Because the ME concept bridges the gap between divine owners and divine governance. Later myth tells the story of Inanna and Enki, where the me are cosmic powers, portable truths about civilization, the authority to judge the knowledge of metalworking, the right to rule. But administrative tablets treat the me like jurisdictional transfers. A temple receives the me of justice, meaning it gains authority over disputes. A city receives the me of kingship, meaning it gains supremacy. And a tablet records the me of grain storage being transferred from one house to another by decree witnessed by officials. This reads like bureaucracy, like departments, like governance functions being assigned, and that changes the atmosphere of the divine world. It makes gods look like institutional nodes. It makes divine authority look like governance infrastructure. And if authority is infrastructure, if it can be transferred, then it can also be withdrawn. Not mythically, not poetically, but administratively. Which leads to the core loop. Again, what does it mean when authority that was once recorded as present becomes recorded as past? What does it mean when divine names remain in the system but cease to appear as active agents? What does it mean when the archive keeps going, but the implied auditor behind the discipline becomes silent? The script insists the tablets never explain the transition. And that is why the transition feels like a haunting. Not because it is supernatural, but because it is administrative. A bureaucracy without a memo. A system without an announcement. An authority that withdraws without filing paperwork. In the next part, we slow down even further on the me. We stay with that strange idea that governance can be treated as a transferable power. Because once you understand how the scribes recorded authority moving between divine houses, you begin to see how later texts record authority moving from divine presence into human procedure law, kingship ritual. And that movement, the shift from active oversight to delegated system, is the center of this story. Not gods in myth, gods in administration. And what happens when administration learns to run without them? The Emmy appear in the record like something that shouldn't be so practical. In later myth, they are cosmic. They are the deep organizing principles of civilization, portable powers that can be stolen, granted, transferred. The story of Inanna and Enki treats them like treasures of reality. The authority to judge, the right to rule, the knowledge of crafts, the frameworks that make cities possible. But in administrative tablets, the ME show up with a different tone. Not as poetic powers, as institutional authorities. A temple receives the me of justice, meaning it gains jurisdiction. A city receives the me of kingship, meaning it gains political supremacy. A house receives the me of grain storage, meaning it gains authority over a critical resource stream. And there is a tablet from the Iana precinct that reads like an agreement. The me of grain storage transferred from the house of Enlil to the house of Inanna by decree witnessed by the temple administrator and the city council. The language is dry. The implications are not. Because authority is being treated as transferable, not metaphorically but administratively. There is a decree, there are witnesses, there is record keeping. The transfer has legal weight. This is what the script keeps asking us to notice. Divine power appears in the archive not only as worship, but as governance. And governance in the archive has procedures. So if the ME can move from one divine house to another, then divine authority is not simply eternal presence. It is something that can be distributed, allocated, reassigned. And when something can be reassigned, the question becomes unavoidable. Reassigned to whom? Reassigned away from whom? And what happens when reassignment becomes permanent? Now, a skeptical reading remains possible. Critics could argue this is simply humans projecting their institutional logic onto the divine. They imagine gods as property owners because temples are property owners. They imagine cosmic decrees as transferable because political power in city-states is transferable. They map their world onto the heavens. And yes, ancient people do that. Human beings model the unknown through what they know. But this explanation still leaves something unresolved. Because if the divine language is purely projection, we would expect it to be flexible, inconsistent, symbolic. Instead, it is procedural. It has start dates. It has witness structures. It is embedded in the legal and economic machinery. It is written down because it changes how resources are controlled. And the scribes who did this were not naive. They operated a complex bureaucracy. They could distinguish ritual from inventory. Their archives show that distinction thousands of times. So when the scribes treat divine authority as an administrative object that can be transferred, they are not merely telling stories. They are maintaining a system. And systems are where the later silence becomes meaningful. Because once authority becomes system, once divine power is embedded as governance infrastructure, then withdrawal does not have to look like gods vanishing in drama. It can look like procedure continuing without their direct participation. The temples can keep receiving offerings even if the gods never speak. The courts can keep issuing verdicts even if the gods never adjudicate. The kings can keep claiming mandate even if no divine council appears to grant it anew. The system runs on what was established, on what was transferred, on what was authorized. And the ME concept becomes a kind of blueprint for that authority can be granted once and then administered without continuous divine presence. This brings us back again to kingship descending from heaven, because the king list frames kingship as a transfer, a descent, a movement of authority from above to below. And if kingship itself is framed as transferred authority, then later kingship can persist as inherited office because the original transfer remains the foundation. You no longer need the gods to descend each generation. You need only the memory that they once did. So, divine presence becomes divine precedent. Authority becomes authorized structure, and the archive keeps going. But the script insists on another discomfort, the boundary. The flood divides time. The pre-flood kings reign impossibly long. After the flood reign lengths collapse toward human scale, the Atrahasis tradition frames this as policy change. Divine governance responds to crisis by implementing limits, mortality, fertility constraints, systemic boundaries. And once limits are in place, the need for direct intervention decreases. So you begin to see a coherent drift gods move from managers to founders, from operators to originators, from active authorities to passive guarantors. And yet this is where the loop tightens. We never get an explanation for the shift. We get documentation. We get patterns. We get the quiet accumulation of absence. But no tablet ever says, "Here is why the gods withdrew." No tablet ever records a divine decree announcing, "From now on, we will no longer intervene." No tablet ever describes a meeting in the divine council where someone decides to step back. Instead, the archive shows the consequences. Divine names remain, divine institutions remain, but agency recedes. So the question returns as it must. Did the gods withdraw because the system matured? Did they withdraw because catastrophe forced policy change? Did they withdraw because human institutions learned to function without them? Or did they withdraw because something made intervention impossible? The script does not answer. It does not even pretend to. It only traces the pattern, and the pattern begins, strangely enough, in the most mundane place, a tablet recording a transfer of grain storage authority between divine houses witnessed by human officials. Because if you can record divine authority transferring like a department's jurisdiction, then you can record divine authority ceasing to appear as active management and still keep the system running. And that is what we're going to watch next, how the flood narrative preserves not only catastrophe, but governance restructuring, how the gods set limits and then step back, and how later legal codes and royal inscriptions reflect a world where divine authority is invoked constantly without being operationally present. In the next part, we return to the king list one more time, but now with the flood boundary framed as administrative restructuring. We sit with the abrupt collapse of reign lengths, not as mythic exaggeration, but as the archive's way of preserving a shift in how the world works. And from there we move into atrahasis, the story that reads less like moral judgment and more like policy failure loopholes and the establishment of limits that replace oversight. Because once you see the gods governing like administrators, you begin to see why their withdrawal might look exactly the way it does. Not dramatic disappearance, just a system that keeps running after the founders stop showing up. We keep returning to the king list because it keeps insisting on a boundary, not a gentle gradient, a line, an era measured in tens of thousands, then the flood, then a collapse into human-scale time. And the more you hold that structure in your mind, the more it begins to resemble the very pattern we're tracing with divine authority, not the gods disappearing from belief, but the gods receding from operational presence. The king list doesn't say myth begins here. It doesn't say symbolic time starts now. It doesn't warn you. It simply records. Alulim, 28,800 years. Alalgar, 36,000. And Menluwana, 43,200. Then the flood sweeps over. Then Kish begins with 1,200 years. Then 960, then 600, then 400. Then within only a few generations, reigns begin to look like something a human court could actually witness. And that collapse is what matters, because it is not only about time, it is about structure. It suggests that the world operated according to one set of conditions, then another. It suggests that what was possible before the boundary was no longer possible after. And the archive preserves that shift as if it were a fact that had to be remembered. Even if later scribes no longer understood it, even if they could no longer explain it, they kept the numbers, they kept the sequence, they kept the boundary. And the same thing may be true of divine presence. Early tablets treat divine names as owners, as authorities, as operational categories. Later tablets treat the same names as invocations, as legitimizers, as memory. And somewhere between those modes is a boundary the archive never explains. The flood traditions offer a narrative framework for that kind of boundary. And the Atrahasis epic is particularly revealing because it does not present catastrophe as moral drama. It presents it as governance failure. It begins with an institutional problem labor. The lesser gods, the Agigi, are exhausted. They dig irrigation canals. They maintain the rivers. They perform the physical labor required to keep the world functioning. They refuse to continue. The great gods face a crisis. The infrastructure of creation requires maintenance, but the workers have rebelled. Enki proposes a solution that sounds in the script's framing like administrative restructuring. Create humans to bear the labor burden. Humanity is fashioned from clay and divine blood, not for romance, not for poetic purpose, but as a workforce. A management solution, an institutional fix. It works. Humans multiply. They take over labor. They maintain canals and temples. They keep the machinery of the world running. Then another problem emerges: noise. The epic is explicit. Humanity becomes too numerous, too loud. The sound of cities disturbs Enlil's sleep, and the disturbance is framed not as sin, but as population density. Too many people making too much noise. Creation disrupted by sheer volume. Enlil decides to reduce the population. He sends plague. Humanity suffers. But Enki intervenes. He teaches humans how to appease the plague god, how to make the right offerings. The plague ends. Enlil tries again: drought. Enki intervenes again, showing humans how to access underground water. The drought fails to reduce population enough. And then Enlil proposes the flood. Not as moral judgment, but as reset total elimination of the problem through eliminating the population. The gods debate, they do not agree. And this is crucial. Divine authority is not monolithic. It is a council with internal conflict, policy contested, governance unstable. Enki opposes the plan, but he is bound by oath not to warn humanity directly. So he finds a loophole. He speaks to a reed wall, technically not addressing the human who listens on the other side. Build a boat. The instructions are precise: dimensions, materials, sealing with bitumen. The epic reads like engineering delivered through bureaucratic workaround. And then the flood comes. Humanity is destroyed except for those in the boat. And then, unexpectedly, the gods are not triumphant. They are horrified. They realize they have destroyed their workforce. They have ended sacrifices. They have halted temple maintenance. They have destabilized their own system. The epic says explicitly, when the survivor offers sacrifice after the flood, the gods gather around it like flies. They are hungry. They need humanity. Enlil is furious that anyone survived, but the others override him. A new policy must be established. The gods swear oaths binding agreements the text treats as enforceable. They will not destroy humanity again, but humanity will not be allowed to multiply without constraint. So, the epic lists the new controls: infertility for some women, children, dying young priestesses forbidden to bear children, demons taking infants, and most importantly, for our pattern, human lifespan limited. No more multi-century spans. No more conditions that allow impossible reign lengths. Not because humans suddenly became weaker, but because the system now requires limits to prevent future crisis. And once limits are in place, the need for direct intervention decreases. That's the governance logic Atrahasis preserves. The gods tried direct management, plague, drought, flood. It produced disaster. So they shift to structural controls, mortality, fertility constraints, boundaries built into the system. And then they step back, not absent from ritual, not absent from temple economy, but absent from daily management. This is the drift we keep tracing. Early eras, gods act. Later eras, gods authorize systems. Eventually, systems operate on their own. And the flood becomes the narrative hinge that makes this drift intelligible, the moment when direct intervention is seen as failure and governance shifts toward distance. Now, the script does not claim we should take Atrahasis as literal history. It treats it as evidence of how Mesopotamians conceptualize change as policy, as restructuring, as withdrawal, without complete disappearance. And if that conceptual framework shaped how scribes recorded authority, it would explain why later records invoke gods constantly while showing them less and less. It would explain why legal codes begin with divine mandate, but operate through human procedure. It would explain why kings claim authority from heaven, but inherit it through bloodlines. It would explain why divine names remain everywhere, while divine agency recedes. In the next part, we stay inside Atrahasis a little longer, not to add new material, but to let its implications breathe, because it offers a model for the silence, not God's dying, but God's learning, not God's defeated, but God's delegating, not God's vanishing, but God's stepping back after policy failure. And that model begins to make the later legal and political drift feel less like randomness and more like a pattern preserved in clay. Atrahasis preserves something that feels almost modern in its logic governance as policy crisis, as management failure, catastrophe, as miscalculation, and reform as restructuring. And the more you sit with that, the more the later silence begins to feel like an aftermath, not of battle, but of learning. The gods create humans as a labor solution. Humans multiply. Humans make noise. Enlil responds with interventions. Enki undermines them. Conflict inside the divine council escalates until a flood becomes the attempted final fix. Then the flood nearly destroys the gods' own system. The gods realize they need humanity. They swear oaths. They establish limits. And the system continues with less direct involvement. That's the arc. And notice what it does not contain. It does not contain a triumphant divine ending. It does not contain a clean moral. It does not say, and therefore, the gods always punish wickedness. It says something more ambiguous. Governance requires balance, and direct control can lead to disaster. So the gods shift from supervision to parameters, from active management to structural constraint, from intervention to embedded law. And that shift is exactly the kind of shift that would appear in the archive as silence, not as disappearance of names, but as disappearance of agency. Because once authority is embedded as system, the system can run without constant presence. And this is where the technical precision of the flood instruction matters, not because it proves literal history, but because it reinforces the script's theme. Divine communication appears as procedure. Build a boat. Seal it with bitumen. Follow specifications. The message is not poetic, it is operational. And in that operational tone, the flood narrative becomes less mythic and more administrative, an instruction manual delivered through loophole. And then after the flood, the gods respond not with renewed closeness, but with distance. They implement policy and step back. And that stepping back gradual, normalized, never explained. In a single decree resembles the pattern we see across later records. Legal codes stop showing gods as daily adjudicators. Royal inscriptions stop showing gods as speaking agents. Divination shifts toward technical sign reading rather than spontaneous oracle. Temples keep functioning as institutions, even when divine presence becomes implied rather than active. So, Atrahasis offers a kind of interpretive spine. The silence is not necessarily abandonment. It can be delegation carried to completion. And the script circles this idea because it is the only thing that makes the archive's drift feel coherent. The gods don't disappear. They withdraw. They don't die. They recede. They don't lose authority. They transform authority into structure. And that transformation does not require a dramatic moment. It can happen the way bureaucracies change through procedures, becoming routine through policies, becoming precedents through systems, becoming self-sustaining. Which brings us again to law, because law is where this transformation becomes visible in a particularly sharp way. The script points to a shift across legal codes. Early codes present gods as active participants in justice. Later codes present gods as authorizers at the beginning and punishers in hypothetical future, but not operators in daily procedure. And the pattern is subtle, which is why it matters. It's the kind of shift that looks like just style until you place it in sequence and realize it moves in one direction. The Code of Ur-Nammu opens with divine mandate. The gods An and Enlil choose the king to establish justice. The language presents the gods as present authorities, with the king acting as their agent. Later, the Code of Lipit Ishtar still invokes divine endorsement, but the operative provisions increasingly rely on human mechanisms. By Hammurabi's time, the prologue is saturated with divine authorization. Anu and Enlil designate him Marduk, grants him kingship. Shamash bestows justice. The image shows the transfer. The text names the gods lavishly. And then once the transfer is established, the gods vanish from the mechanics. 282 provisions follow, and enforcement is human. Judges are human. Officials are human. Penalties are carried out by human administration. Divine authority becomes an origin point, not a daily participant. And that is exactly what Atrahasis suggests would happen after a governance crisis. The gods establish limits and withdraw from constant intervention. So, when the legal archive shifts toward human procedure under divine mandate, it doesn't look like secularization so much as delegation. Authority handed down, then administered, then normalized, then remembered. And the script keeps turning the same question in its hands. Why do gods stop enforcing what they once governed? Why do they authorize systems and then vanish from operation? Why do they become guarantors of legitimacy rather than managers of process? And crucially, why does the archive never explain the transition? If a council of gods decided to withdraw, why isn't that recorded? If the flood was the hinge, why isn't there a tablet that says, "After this, we will no longer intervene"? Instead, the archive behaves like a world where the withdrawal was slow, accepted, normalized, like no single generation experienced it as crisis, like the shift happened within continuity, and that is why the silence is so unsettling, because it suggests a transformation too gradual to be reported, yet profound enough to change everything. In the next part, we step fully into the legal drift the script outlines. We watch divine authority move from present tense to past tense without ever losing its claim to legitimacy. We watch contracts invoke gods as witnesses while relying entirely on human enforcement. We watch codes warn future kings of divine punishment while offering no divine involvement in current judgments. We watch the system run as if the gods are still there, because their authorization remains the foundation, even as their operational presence becomes unnecessary. And the question will return as it must: is this simply the maturation of institutions, or is it the record of a real withdrawal that the scribes could only preserve through what they stopped writing? The earliest law codes do not treat gods as distant abstractions. They treat them as active authorities, present in the structure of justice, embedded in the legitimacy of verdicts, and implied in the enforcement of order. And then across centuries, the same gods remain invoked, while their operational role fades. The shift is subtle, but it is consistent enough to feel like a pattern rather than accident. The Code of Ur-Nammu, dating to around 2010 BC, opens with the king stating that he has been chosen by the gods On and Enlil to establish justice in the land. And the language matters. It is not merely I rule with divine favor. It is divine authority acts through me. The gods are described as current overseers and the king as executor. The prologue frames the legal reforms as divine justice implemented in human society. The authority is living present tense active. A century later, the Code of Lipit Ishtar maintains divine mandate. Enlil grants kingship. Justice must be established. But the structure begins to tilt. The prologue still centers divine endorsement, yet the operative provisions property, marriage, slavery, inheritance work increasingly through human procedure without invoking divine agency in each judgment. Then Hammurabi. By 1750 BC, the prologue becomes an avalanche of divine authorization. Anu and Enlil designate him. Marduk grants him kingship. Shamash gives him justice. The gods' names are everywhere piled carefully, as if legitimacy must be layered until it is unbreakable. And then once the authorization is complete, the gods vanish from the mechanics. 282 provisions follow. They are executed by human officials. Evidence is evaluated by human judges. Penalties are carried out through human enforcement. Appeals involve human authority. The gods do not appear as daily adjudicators. They do not speak. They do not intervene in the procedure. They authorize. Then they recede. The epilogue returns to divine threat. Future kings who alter the laws will face divine punishment. But even that has the same shape. The gods are positioned as eventual punishers of hypothetical future violations, not as active overseers of present justice. They become guardians of continuity, not operators of process. And the famous image, the king receiving the laws from Shamash, captures the transformation in a single gesture, a transfer. Authority moving from divine source to human administrator. Once transferred, the system runs. This is not the disappearance of religion, it is the formalization of delegation. And it shows up in legal practice as well. Contracts from the old Babylonian period invoke gods as witnesses, but enforcement mechanisms are entirely human. Court records reference divine justice as principle, but document human judicial proceedings. Temple archives preserve thousands of legal texts, land sales, loans, marriages, adoptions. And while these documents often begin with divine invocation, they end with human seals, human signatures, human guarantees. The gods authorize the framework, humans operate it. And once you see that pattern in law, it begins to look less like a literary quirk and more like a civilizational drift. Because law is not simply belief. Law is procedure. Law is how disputes are resolved. Law is how property moves. Law is how order is maintained. So, if divine authority withdraws from law's daily mechanism while remaining invoked as legitimacy, that suggests a world where the divine has become structural rather than interactive. Authority without presence. And this is the same transformation we saw implied in Atrahasis after crisis. The gods establish limits, then step back. They no longer manage through constant intervention. They embed boundaries and let the system operate. So the legal drift becomes a reflection of the cosmic drift. The gods become founders of order rather than managers of its daily operation. And still the script returns to the same question. Why stop enforcing what you once governed? Why step back if you remain sovereign? Why allow humans to administer justice alone while still claiming divine mandate as its source? The archive never gives a direct answer. It gives only the shape of change, and that shape repeats in kingship as well. Early kingship is framed as descending from heaven. Authority arrives, it is granted, it is not merely inherited. Later kingship becomes bloodline dynasty office, still sacred, still legitimate through divine language, but not refreshed through direct descent each generation. The mythic claim remains. The operational mechanism shifts. And the same drift appears in epic tradition with Gilgamesh, a ruler described with measurable divine fraction, 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, whose era ends after which kings remain human administrators under divine mandate rather than hybrid beings with divine blood. The script's argument is not that we must accept the fractions literally. It is that the texts preserve the ending of a category. They preserve a boundary after Gilgamesh no successors claim such measurable divinity. The hybrid age closes, the office remains, the mandate remains. But the nature of kingship becomes more procedural, more human, and law follows the same path. Divine authorization remains, divine operation recedes. So, when we ask about the Anunnaki, when we ask why they stop appearing as active authorities, we are not asking about religion fading. We are asking about governance changing. We are asking about how a system once recorded as interactive becomes recorded as self-sustaining. And the archive shows that self-sustaining systems can keep invoking founders long after founders stop acting. The question becomes not only where did the gods go, but how did institutions continue without them? Because continuity is what the archive is built to preserve. And continuity can hide transformation if transformation happens slowly enough. In the next part, we move into Gilgamesh more fully, not as a detour into myth, but as another boundary marker the script uses to trace the withdrawal of divine human immediacy. 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, a ratio repeated with unusual precision. A final hybrid figure whose mortality becomes the epic's central tragedy. A ruler who cannot escape death, whose line ends, whose successors are simply kings. We follow that boundary into the next one. Anu, himself supreme authority, yet almost entirely absent, whose silence becomes a model for sovereignty as distance. Because the more you look, the more the archive seems to be describing a world where power remains, but presence withdraws. Gilgamesh is described with a precision that myths don't usually require. 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. Not half, not vaguely descended from the gods. 2/3, a fraction specific enough to feel deliberate, repeated across versions, as if the ratio itself matters to understanding what he was. The old Babylonian version of the epic, around 1800 BC, preserves older Sumerian tradition and begins with that formula. His parentage is documented Lugalbanda, a mortal king later deified. Ninsun, a goddess described as the wild cow of wisdom and strength. Their union produces Gilgamesh, and the text is explicit about the mixture. 2/3 divine, 1/3 mortal. The mathematics are unusual. Most mythologies treat divine human offspring as half one divine parent, one human parent producing a demigod. But Gilgamesh's fraction doesn't fit simple parentage. It implies concentration across generations, or a formula that scribes maintained because it carried meaning. And the epic treats his mixed nature as observable. He is taller, stronger, less easily fatigued, capable of distances and feats ordinary men cannot match. The text presents this not as occasional miracle, but as baseline. And still he is mortal. This becomes the epic's central gravity. Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh confronts death, and the second half of the epic is his refusal to accept the limitation built into his mortal third. He seeks Utnapishtim, the flood survivor granted immortality. He finds him. He hears the story of how divine favor can grant eternal life under unique circumstances following the flood. But when Gilgamesh is tested, he fails. He cannot stay awake for 7 days. He cannot outrun the simplest constraint of human nature, fatigue. The gods gave immortality once as exception. They swore never to repeat it. And for Gilgamesh, no exception is made. He returns to Uruk without the gift he wanted. And the epic ends not with his triumph over death, but with his acceptance of it. He turns toward legacy, the walls of Uruk, the structures he built the city that will outlast his flesh. This is the script's point in returning to Gilgamesh. Not the adventure, the boundary. Gilgamesh is the last of his kind. After him, no ruler in Mesopotamian tradition claims the two-thirds divine formula. Kings continue invoking divine favor. They continue claiming divine mandate. But the measurable fraction, divine blood, as a recorded proportion, disappears. And the Sumerian king list includes Gilgamesh with a reign length that is long but not impossible 126 years. Still inflated by modern standards, but nothing like the pre-flood tens of thousands. His reign sits inside the era where numbers are compressing toward human time. So Gilgamesh becomes a hinge, a figure who carries divine human immediacy into an era already moving toward distance. A ruler who has a goddess mother but cannot escape death. A king who marks the end of hybrid kingship, after which kingship becomes office under mandate rather than blood under divinity. Skeptics will argue reasonably that the two-thirds formula is symbolic, that it is numerology, that mythic fractions do not require literal biology. The script does not demand literalism. It demands attention to how the archive treats the ending, because the tradition does not present Gilgamesh as one among many hybrid rulers. It presents him as the last. It preserves the closure of the category. His funeral is described in fragmentary Sumerian poems with elaborate ritual. His tomb is said to be built in the Euphrates riverbed. The river diverted the tomb constructed sealed, then water released so it could never be disturbed, never excavated, never proven. The riverbed holds its secrets. The texts remain. And the texts preserve a figure described with unusual precision as possessing measurable divine heritage, whose mortality becomes unavoidable and whose line ends. After him, kingship continues without divine fractions. So again, the pattern emerges, not the gods disappearing from language, but direct divine human immediacy receding. The gods remain invoked, the gods remain sovereign in ideology. But the nature of presence shifts. And then we reach the highest name, the one at the top of the hierarchy, Anu, supreme authority over the Anunnaki. and across millennia of tablets, Anu barely appears as an active agent. He issues no regular decrees in the record. He intervenes in no daily affairs. His authority is absolute, but his presence is rare enough that absence becomes defining. And that matters because Anu's silence is not the silence of a forgotten god. It is the silence of a sovereign too distant to participate, or of a system too mature to require participation. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, preserves Anu's position at the foundation. When Apsu and Tiamat threaten, Anu confronts and retreats. Ea acts. Later, Marduk defeats Tiamat and receives authority. But Anu remains ultimate sovereign, the source from which legitimacy flows. And yet Anu does not manage. The system operates through delegation. Enlil administers earth. Enki provides wisdom. Shamash oversees justice. Ishtar intervenes in war and love. Marduk rules in Babylonian theology. But Anu remains remote, invoked in oaths, seated at the top, rarely acting. So Anu becomes a model supreme authority as distance. And if supreme authority can exist without presence, then the withdrawal of other gods becomes easier to imagine, not as disappearance, as receding into the level of structure. In the next part, we stay with Anu's silence and what it implies. We hold the idea of delegation authority flowing downward through hierarchy, and we ask how a civilization built on divine mandate could function for millennia with gods increasingly absent from operational records, because the archive suggests that it did. And the question becomes, was that absence always the nature of sovereignty, or did sovereignty become absent over time? Anu's silence sits at the top of that mystery, like a fixed star. At the top of the Mesopotamian divine hierarchy sits Anu, supreme authority, source of legitimacy, the name invoked in the most solemn oaths. The sovereign whose mandate underwrites the entire cosmic order. And yet across thousands of tablets, Anu barely appears as an active participant. He receives offerings. His temple holds estates. His cult employs personnel. His authority is everywhere, in principle. But his voice is almost nowhere in the record. That absence is not accidental in the tradition. It is structural. The Enuma Elish places Anu at the foundation. When Apsu and Tiamat threaten the younger gods, Anu confronts them first, but cannot resolve the crisis. He retreats. Ea acts. Later, when Tiamat escalates, the gods gather in council and offer kingship to whoever can defeat her. Marduk succeeds and receives supreme authority, but Anu remains. Marduk rules, but under Anu's overarching sovereignty. The divine council convenes in Anu's court. Cosmic order is framed as operating under principles Anu established, and yet once the system is in place, Anu does not manage. He does not descend into daily affairs. He does not adjudicate every dispute. He does not issue constant instructions. He remains remote. And that remoteness in the script's reading becomes a model sovereignty as distance. Because ancient Near Eastern governance operates through delegation. Earthly kings appoint governors, judges, administrators, agents who act with royal mandate without requiring constant royal presence. The system functions because authority can flow downward, while sovereignty remains concentrated at the top. The Mesopotamian divine hierarchy mirrors this logic. Anu occupies the ultimate position, but governance is delegated to the great gods Enlil Enki, later Marduk, who in turn delegate functions to lesser deities overseeing specific domains. In that model, Anu's absence is not weakness, it is efficiency. The system runs because it is designed to run. Anu's authority is supreme precisely because it does not need to be demonstrated through constant intervention. And this is where the larger pattern returns, because the other gods also withdraw over time. Not from worship, not from legitimacy, but from direct agency in administrative and legal records. Enlil, Enki, Shamash, Ishtar, Marduk names remain invoked. Temples remain functioning. Ritual calendars remain precise. But direct divine action becomes rarer in official documentation. So Anu's silence begins to resemble not an exception, but a template. A world where the highest authority is the least visible. A world where divinity increases with distance. A cosmos that runs on established principles rather than continuous intervention. And that raises a deeper question the script places quietly in the background. Did the gods withdraw because the system matured, or did the system persist because the gods were no longer able or no longer willing to intervene? The text preserves no explicit answer. It preserves only the operational reality the machinery continues. Temple administration functions for centuries with extraordinary consistency. Ritual schedules are maintained. Legal systems operate. Kingship persists. Empires rise and fall, yet the institutional framework remains recognizably continuous. The system runs. And if the system runs, then perhaps divine presence becomes less necessary. Perhaps the founders step back because their work is complete. Perhaps the world no longer requires supervision because limits and hierarchies have been embedded deeply enough that they function autonomously. That is one reading. And the script allows another more unsettling possibility. Perhaps Anu's distance is not chosen remoteness, but enforced separation. Perhaps the gods became trapped in their own hierarchy. Perhaps the delegation became irreversible. Perhaps intervention became impossible or forbidden. But again, no tablet explains. No official statement exists. Only the pattern authority persists as principle, while presence recedes as practice. And that pattern does not stop with Anu. It amplifies as we move forward into later eras where divine names remain everywhere, while divine agency becomes almost entirely indirect. In the Neo-Assyrian period, roughly 900 to 600 BC, the shift becomes unmistakable in how texts are written. Kings produce extensive annals, documenting campaigns, building projects, administration. The gods are invoked constantly. Every victory is credited to divine favor. Every building project is undertaken at divine command. But the gods do not speak. They do not appear. They do not intervene as agents inside the narrative. Divine approval becomes inferred from outcomes rather than delivered through direct presence. The language of mandate remains, but the operational reality is human. Temple archives from the same era show the same thing, offerings listed estates, managed personnel assigned. The gods are named constantly as recipients and owners, but never as actors issuing instructions. And divination becomes technical omen texts, celestial sign lists, reference manuals. The gods embed messages and patterns, but humans decode them mechanically through established charts. Divine communication becomes methodology. The gods remain sovereign in ideology, but sovereignty operates through structure rather than speech. And this is where Anu's silence becomes more than a theological detail. It becomes the endpoint of a drift, the divine as ultimate foundation, always present as legitimacy, increasingly absent as agency. In the next part, we enter the Neo-Assyrian and later record directly royal inscriptions, temple archives, omen compendia, not to add new material, but to let the script's final pattern breathe. Because by that point, the Anunnaki do not need to disappear to become absent. They simply become names that authorize a system that no longer requires them. And the most unsettling part remains: no tablet ever explains the transition. The archive just keeps going. By the Neo-Assyrian period, roughly 900 to 600 BC, something has shifted in how divine authority is documented. The gods remain central to religious life, to royal ideology, to the conceptual framework of Mesopotamian civilization. Their names are everywhere. Their temples are active. Their festivals continue. Offerings are made with precision. Kings invoke divine mandate constantly. And yet in the record, the gods no longer act. Not as agents inside the narrative, not as voices speaking directly, not as participants in daily governance. The silence isn't sudden. It accumulates. It becomes normal. It becomes the shape of the world. Neo-Assyrian kings, Ashur-nasir-pal II, Shalmaneser, the third Sargon II, produce extensive annals. They document campaigns, victories, building projects, administrative achievements. Every success is attributed to divine favor. Every action is framed as undertaken at divine command. But the gods never speak. They do not appear. They do not intervene in the way earlier traditions describe. When a city falls, the king credits the great gods. But the credit is retrospective theological interpretation of outcome, not a record of divine speech during the event. Compare this to earlier royal tradition, where gods are described as transferring authority, appearing, guiding decisions. By the Neo-Assyrian era, divine agency has moved into the background. The gods authorize the king's role in principle, but the king's actions unfold through human strategy and human administration. Temple archives show the same pattern. Thousands of administrative texts survive offerings, property transactions, priestly appointments, ritual schedules. The machinery of religion operates at scale. The gods receive goods. Their estates produce yields. Their cults employ personnel. Their festivals are maintained. But nowhere in these administrative records do the gods issue instructions. They do not respond to queries. They do not intervene in management. The entire apparatus runs as if the gods are theoretical owners, present as categories, absent as administrators. And ritual texts become increasingly procedural. Ceremonies are specified in detail, gestures, prayers, offerings measured and timed. The precision is extraordinary. But the rituals no longer expect response in the way earlier texts imply. They maintain cosmic order through performance, not through conversation. Divination continues, but its character shifts. Instead of spontaneous divine messages, we get technical sign reading. Omen texts proliferate vast compilations, correlating celestial events with outcomes, liver patterns with predictions, dream symbols with meanings. These texts function like manuals, like charts, like systems that can be consulted. The gods embed messages in phenomena, but the decoding is mechanical. Humans become trained readers of predetermined patterns rather than recipients of direct speech. Divine communication becomes natural law. And this is where astrology rises in importance. The stars and planets move in observable patterns. Those patterns can be correlated with earthly events. Over generations, scholars compile databases of observations and outcomes. Mathematical models predict positions. Interpretation becomes system. And the system works because the cosmos is assumed to operate autonomously according to principles established long ago, principles attributed to gods who no longer need to intervene directly. The silence is not collapse, it is stability. Mesopotamia in this era reaches heights of political power and administrative sophistication. Cities flourish, empires expand. The machinery of civilization operates with efficiency, as if the gods who founded the system completed their work and stepped back, leaving behind structures capable of perpetuating themselves. And this is the core pattern the script has been tracing from the beginning. The Anunnaki begin as institutional realities, names in ledgers, owners of property, authorities embedded in administration. They transition into legitimizers, grantors of mandate, founders of law, sources of kingship. Finally, they become ancestral memory, invoked in ritual, honored in theology, but absent as active agents. Not through dramatic disappearance, through normalization, through delegation carried so far that presence becomes unnecessary, and no tablet ever explains why. There is no final battle, no cosmic war, no decree announcing withdrawal, no moment of official transition. The divine era doesn't end loudly. It simply stops being documented as present and starts being remembered as past. Across 3,000 years of written records, the pattern repeats with bureaucratic patience. The same names, the same temples, the same invocations, while agency recedes. Each generation inherits a system slightly more human-administered than the one before, slightly less dependent on direct divine intervention, slightly more capable of running on institutional momentum. The silence accumulates slowly, like sediment, until you place early tablets beside later chronicles and realize the difference would have been almost invisible to those living through it. The king list preserves a boundary. Flood traditions preserve a policy shift. Legal codes preserve delegation. Gilgamesh preserves the ending of hybrid kingship. Anu preserves sovereignty as distance. Neo-Assyrian texts preserve a world where gods authorize but do not speak. Each piece alone can be explained away. Together they form a pattern that explains nothing, but documents everything. A systematic withdrawal of divine presence from the operational mechanisms of civilization, leaving behind memory ritual and structures that persist without founders. Perhaps the gods completed their work and departed. Perhaps they were called away. Perhaps they never existed, as the records suggest, and what we're tracing is the evolution of theology from immediacy to abstraction. Or perhaps the scribes noticed something they could not explain: power that withdrew without reason, authority that stopped intervening, but remained invoked. The tablets do not decide for us. They do not argue. They do not persuade. They simply keep going, grain after grain, rain after rain, ritual after ritual, documenting the world as it continued. Without the active presence of beings who once required the same bureaucratic precision as barley inventories. History doesn't always end in drama. Sometimes it ends in silence. Sometimes it ends in a category that remains in the ledger, while the hand that once demanded the ledger is no longer there. And the question remains pressed into clay and carried forward across millennia, waiting in the gap between what the tablets say and what they no longer say. What kind of authority withdraws without explanation and is never replaced? Maybe that's the point. Or maybe the silence itself is the only answer the Anunnaki left behind.